The war between homeowners and overzealous HOA boards is a tale as old as time, but for me, it wasn't just about fines or parking violations. It became a fight for my mother's life. It all started when we moved into what we thought was a peaceful suburban neighborhood, a place where lawns were neatly trimmed, and the only disturbance came from the occasional overly enthusiastic dad mowing his yard at 7 a.m. But beneath the perfectly pruned hedges and pastel-colored houses lurked something far more insidious. Karen Thompson, the iron-fisted president of our HOA, and her equally conniving husband, Doug. At first, it was small things, letters in the mail citing violations that didn't exist, fines for having improperly placed flower pots, and threats about repainting our house a shade darker than what the HOA deemed acceptable. My mother, a strong-willed woman, refused to be bullied. When Karen proposed doubling HOA fees under the guise of neighborhood improvements, my mother was one of the few who voted against it. From that moment, it became clear we had unknowingly declared war against the HOA's reigning tyrant. And Karen never lost a war. As the months dragged on, my mother's health began to decline. At first, it was little things, occasional dizziness, brain fog, and fatigue she brushed off as stress. But then it became worse. She started experiencing violent nausea, confusion so severe she forgot where she was at times, and, most concerningly, kidney and liver problems that left her bedridden. Doctors ran test after test, but nothing added up. They suspected an autoimmune disease, but no treatment seemed to help. Watching my once vibrant mother wither away was agonizing, and no amount of medical intervention seemed to halt her rapid decline. At the same time, the HOA harassment intensified. More fines, more threats of liens on our home, and an increasing sense that we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that these two battles, the one against the HOA and the one against my mother's mysterious illness, were somehow connected. But I had no proof. Not yet. One night, after another long day at the hospital with my mother, I returned home exhausted but restless. A noise outside caught my attention, a faint clinking sound, like metal on metal. I crept outside and followed the noise to the side of our house, where the water meter was located. My blood ran cold as I saw a shadowy figure crouched over the pipes, fiddling with something. The porch light illuminated the scene just enough for me to make out the intruder's face, Doug Thompson. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched him tamper with the water supply, twisting a valve before slinking away into the night like a coward. I didn't know what he had done, but a sickening realization gripped me. I rushed inside and turned off the main water line, unwilling to take any chances. Something was very, very wrong. The next day, I sent a sample of our tap water to a private lab. The results shattered what little peace I had left. Our water contained traces of ethylene glycol, better known as antifreeze. Someone had been poisoning our water supply. Someone had been poisoning my mother. Armed with undeniable proof, I took my findings straight to the police. The slow wheels of justice began turning as investigators gathered evidence, but I wasn't willing to sit idly by. I reached out to our neighbors, sharing my mother's story and the shocking results of the water tests. What I discovered left me speechless. Other families had also suffered mysterious illnesses. Some had lost pets to sudden, unexplained deaths. A pattern emerged. Those who had opposed Karen's aggressive HOA policies had all experienced some form of misfortune. I wasn't dealing with a petty suburban dictator. Karen and Doug weren't just overstepping their power, they were actively harming people who stood in their way. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when an anonymous source provided a damning video. Security footage showing Karen and Doug in their garage, handling antifreeze bottles and discussing how to make sure the job was done right. With this, the police had enough evidence to act. Karen and Doug were arrested, their pristine suburban facade shattered as officers dragged them from their home in handcuffs. Though Karen and Doug's reign of terror had ended, I wasn't satisfied. The HOA board, complicit in their silence, had allowed this to happen. Worse, many of them had still supported Karen even as the truth came to light. I knew the neighborhood's water was controlled by a private company, Clearwater LLC, and a little research revealed it was drowning in debt, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. A plan formed in my mind, a way to ensure the HOA would never hold power over me or my mother again. I liquidated everything I could, my savings, my 401k, even taking out a home equity loan, to buy Clearwater LLC outright. Overnight, I became the sole owner of our community's water supply. And with that power, I did what the HOA had done to us for years. I turned their own rules against them. I announced an immediate 400% increase in water rates for the entire neighborhood, with premium rates specifically for former HOA board members. They begged, they threatened, they tried to take legal action. But there was nothing they could do. They had spent years enforcing their rules without mercy, and now it was their turn to suffer the consequences. As the reality of the water rate hike set in, panic spread like wildfire. Homeowners who had once smugly supported Karen and her iron-fisted rule now found themselves drowning under their own policies. The same people who had voted to fine my mother for a non-conforming mailbox were now the ones showing up at my door, pleading for mercy. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, but without Karen's dictatorial grip, they found themselves powerless. Some board members resigned on the spot, unwilling to face the outrage of the community. Others tried to fight me, threatening lawsuits, but they quickly discovered that I had done my homework. Clearwater LLC had been a private company, and as its legal owner, I had full authority to set the rates as I saw fit. If they didn't like it, they were free to dig their own wells, an expensive and impractical solution for a tightly packed suburban neighborhood. The same HOA that had once wielded power over every aspect of people's lives now found itself at the mercy of a single man, me. And I had no intention of making things easy for the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. They tried to rally support, claiming my actions were unfair and unethical. Some residents, especially those who had always been loyal to Karen, began organizing protests, arguing that I was no better than the HOA had been. But for every person who opposed me, there were 5 others who cheered me on. The silent majority, those who had suffered under Karen's rule but had been too afraid to speak up, finally found their voice. They shared their own horror stories. Elderly couples fined into financial ruin, families forced to repaint their homes multiple times over minor shade variations, neighbors who had lost beloved pets under mysterious circumstances. The evidence of HOA corruption ran deeper than I had ever imagined. And now, people were ready to fight back. The once feared HOA board found itself crumbling as members continued to resign, unable to justify their past actions. The community was fracturing, and for the first time in years, the balance of power was shifting away from the tyrants who had controlled it for so long. More residents began to speak up. Another disturbing pattern emerged. I had already uncovered how Karen and Doug had poisoned my mother, but what I hadn't realized was just how many people had been affected. Families who had opposed the HOA's fee increases had also experienced sudden illnesses, unexplained health issues, and even financial ruin from endless fines. One man came forward with a heartbreaking story. His wife had been hospitalized for kidney failure just months before my mother fell ill. Another neighbor recounted how their dog had died after drinking from an outdoor water bowl, shortly after they had refused to support Karen's re-election. It was sickening. This wasn't just about power and control. Karen had been waging a quiet war against anyone who defied her. And the worst part? Some of the remaining HOA members had known about it. Maybe they hadn't directly participated in the poisoning, but they had turned a blind eye, allowing Karen and Doug to destroy lives without consequence. With this revelation, the remaining HOA board members had no choice but to step down. Their reign of terror was over. Karen and Doug's trial was swift. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Between the lab results, the security footage, and testimonies from multiple residents, there was no room for doubt. They accepted a plea deal, each receiving 12 years in prison for attempted murder, tampering with a public utility, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. But even from behind bars, the damage they had done lingered. My mother's health had improved with treatment, but the poisoning had taken its toll. She was stable for now, but doctors warned that she might need a kidney transplant in the future. The financial burden of her medical care was another battle altogether. But then, something incredible happened. The same neighbors who had once lived in fear of the HOA banded together, launching a fundraiser to help cover my mother's medical expenses. Donations poured in, not just from our neighborhood, but from people all over the state who had heard our story. It was a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were still good people willing to stand up and fight for what was right. With Karen and Doug gone, the HOA officially dissolved. A new community board was formed, not an HOA, but a voluntary group of homeowners dedicated to actual neighborhood improvements. The first order of business? Reversing every ridiculous rule Karen had put in place. Fines were suspended, liens were lifted, and, in a final act of defiance, every banned garden gnome was proudly reinstated. But my work wasn't done yet. I had spent months wielding power over the neighborhood through Clearwater LLC, but I knew I couldn't keep it forever. So, in a final move, I transferred ownership of the company into a community trust. Water rates returned to normal, but all profits from the company would now go toward covering medical expenses for the victims of Karen's poisoning. It was my way of ensuring that no one would ever have to suffer under unchecked power again. As I stood in the newly built community garden, named after my mother in honor of her resilience, I realized that despite everything we had lost, we had gained something even greater. Our neighborhood had once been ruled by fear, but now it was bound together by something far stronger: justice, unity, and the unwavering determination to never let tyranny take root again. With the HOA dissolved and the community freed from Karen's tyranny, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. For the first time in years, people no longer lived in fear of receiving arbitrary fines or threats of foreclosure. The once oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of camaraderie. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other under Karen's rule now came together, sharing stories, helping each other with home repairs, and organizing events that had nothing to do with rigid HOA mandates. The community garden, once a battleground for Karen's petty restrictions, became a symbol of healing. Residents planted flowers, vegetables, and even a few rebellious garden gnomes in honor of those who had suffered under the HOA's rule. My mother, though still recovering, would often sit by the garden, basking in the quiet peace that had replaced the constant stress of fighting off fines and harassment. Watching her smile, even after everything we had endured, made it all worth it. Though Karen and Doug were behind bars, the echoes of their actions still lingered in the lives they had damaged. My mother wasn't the only one still struggling with health issues. Several other residents had ongoing medical problems linked to the poisoning. The financial strain caused by excessive fines, forced home modifications, and legal battles had left scars on many families. Some had drained their savings to keep up with Karen's never-ending demands, and others had nearly lost their homes. It became clear that justice wasn't just about putting Karen and Doug in prison, it was about repairing the damage they had caused. That's where the Clearwater LLC Community Trust came into play. By using the profits from the water company, we were able to start a fund that helped pay for medical bills, reimburse unjust fines, and provide financial relief to those who had suffered the most. What had once been a weapon of control, the neighborhood's water supply, had now become a lifeline for the people who needed it most. Despite everything, some former HOA loyalists still resented me. They argued that raising the water rates had been an abuse of power, even if it was temporary. But most people understood, it wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching them a lesson they would never forget. Power corrupts, and unchecked authority in the wrong hands had nearly destroyed this community. My actions had forced them to experience firsthand what it felt like to be at the mercy of an unfair system. And now that they had learned that lesson, I had no interest in holding on to that power any longer. By transferring Clearwater LLC into a community trust, I ensured that no single person could ever use it as a weapon again. Instead of being controlled by a corporate entity, the water company would now operate for the benefit of the people, providing fair rates while using its profits to help those in need. It was a fitting end to a long and painful chapter, turning an instrument of oppression into a force for good. Though they were locked away, Karen and Doug tried to fight their convictions. They appealed their sentences, hoping for a reduced term, but the sheer weight of evidence against them made it impossible. Their reputation was permanently ruined. News stations had covered the trial extensively, labeling them as the HOA from hell, and their story became a cautionary tale about power-hungry neighborhood associations. Former friends and allies abandoned them, unwilling to associate with convicted criminals. Even their own family distanced themselves. And perhaps the most poetic justice of all? Their assets, once used to fund their oppressive rule, were seized as part of their restitution agreement. Every penny they had extorted from residents, every fine they had unfairly imposed, was now being used to pay for the medical bills of the very people they had harmed. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, but in the end, they had lost everything. As the months passed, life slowly settled into a new normal. My mother's health remained stable, though the possibility of a kidney transplant still loomed in the future. But she was no longer living in fear. She could sit on our porch without worrying about HOA spies watching her every move. She could plant whatever flowers she wanted, display as many garden gnomes as she pleased, and finally enjoy the home we had fought so hard to protect. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear and control, had become a place of unity and resilience. The scars of the past would never fully disappear, but they served as a reminder. Never again would we allow a tyrant to take hold of our community. And as I walked through the newly renamed Thompson Free Community Park, I couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served, the neighborhood had been reclaimed, and for the first time in years, the future finally looked bright. Even though Karen and Doug were rotting away in prison, their presence still haunted the neighborhood. Their house, once the symbol of their unchecked power, sat abandoned, its once pristine lawn now overgrown and wild. No one wanted to buy it, not after everything that had happened. Some neighbors joked that it was cursed, that no matter how many times the real estate agent tried to list it, no one would dare live in a house where the former owners had literally poisoned the community. Occasionally, I'd see kids daring each other to run up and knock on the door, treating it like some kind of haunted house attraction. But to me, it was more than just an empty building, it was a reminder of everything we had endured. A monument to greed, cruelty, and the kind of power that should never be concentrated in the hands of people like Karen and Doug. One day, the city finally took ownership of the property due to unpaid property taxes and decided to demolish it. Watching it get torn down, brick by brick, was one of the most satisfying moments of my. Without the HOA's oppressive rules, people started making changes, real changes. No longer restricted by Karen's ridiculous guidelines, families repainted their homes in colors that actually suited their tastes, not just what was deemed acceptable by a tyrant with a clipboard. Driveways that had once been threatened with fines for minor cracks were finally repaired on homeowners' own terms. More and more garden gnomes popped up, almost as a symbol of rebellion. Some neighbors even put up little signs next to them that said, "Never again." The old HOA clubhouse, which had once been used for endless, soul-sucking meetings about shrub height regulations, was transformed into a true community center. Instead of being a place where neighbors were berated for minor infractions, it became a hub for social events, fundraisers, and even free tutoring sessions for kids. For the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a real community, not just a place where people lived in constant fear of a letter in their mailbox. Despite being locked away, Karen wasn't ready to let go of her grip entirely. She sent letters, rambling, furious, and borderline delusional. Some were to former HOA members, urging them to restore order and reclaim the neighborhood from anarchy. Others were to local news outlets, desperately trying to paint herself as the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. None of it worked. The world had moved on without her. No one cared about her complaints anymore, and her influence had vanished the moment those handcuffs clicked around her wrists. One letter, however, was different. It was addressed to me. Unlike the others, it wasn't filled with demands or manipulations. It was a single pathetic plea, "I hope you're happy." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say and why Mother's recovery was slow, but every day, she grew a little stronger. The damage done by the poisoning wasn't reversible, but with dialysis and careful monitoring, she was able to regain a sense of normalcy. The fundraiser set up by the community helped cover her medical bills, a kindness I would never forget. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to defy Karen's rule now came by regularly to check on her, bringing home-cooked meals, flowers, and stories about how much better life had become. Watching her sit outside in the sun, drinking tea and chatting with neighbors without a care in the world, was something I had feared I would never see again. She was still my mother, the strong, stubborn woman who had refused to be bullied into submission, but she was also someone who had been to the edge and fought her way back. As the months passed, the community continued to heal. New families moved in, never knowing the nightmare that had once plagued our streets. The scars left behind by Karen's reign would always be there, but they no longer defined us. The power that had once been used to control and destroy had been reclaimed for the good of the people. And while I no longer held the reins of the water company, I knew that as long as we stayed vigilant, we would never let another Karen rise to power again. One day, as I walked past the community garden named in my mother's honor, I saw a new plaque that someone had added beneath her name. It read, "A reminder that no one is above justice." And as I stood there, looking at the thriving plants, the laughter of children playing nearby, and the neighbors who had once been strangers but were now friends, I knew one thing for certain: we had won.